Welcome back to my channel, Prufrock's Life and Library. So this video is the second part of episode 2 of Philosophy with Prufrock. In the first part, we have talked about madness, and this video is a continuation. And if you haven't watched my first video yet, please go to the link in the description. And if you have, without any further ado, let's get into the video. Okay, now in the first part of our video, while we were talking about madness, the book that I have chosen to refer to was this one, which is Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari. And in the second part, which is this one, we are going to take reference of this book, A Philosophy of Madness, The Experience of Psychotic Thinking by Walter Custers. Now, there is a big reason why I have chosen these two books to talk about madness. Firstly, because both of them talks about madness and relating madness to several other things. But the perspective of these two books are very different. Now, this one, written by Deleuze and Guattari, has the perspective of a philosopher and a psychoanalyst. While in this one, by Custers, this book, Custers is a philosopher as well, but he is also someone who has had the experience of psychosis. So, in a way, the psychoanalyst is psychoanalyzing the madness which is his own. So, that makes this book a very interesting one, as well as a very enlightening one. Before I get into the context of this book, let us first talk about the scenarios that made Custers write this book in the first place. So this is, it can be considered as a sequel to his first book on madness, which was named as Pure Madness. Now, this book has also won the Dutch Philosophy Book of the Year in the year of 2014, if I'm not wrong. 2014, and this was primarily written in Dutch, and this is an English translation by MIT Press. Now, in an interview, Walter Custers says that to understand madness or the state of being while a person is in the psychosis, there are certain unlearnings that one has to go through. For example, one has to forget their self, the language, as well as their sense of existence, their sense of their surrounding, the community they are in, the language that is inbuilt within them, that gives meaning to them and their relation to the society. These all are the factors that has to be unlearned by the person who is within the psychosis. Now, Costa says, as he was someone who has experienced psychosis twice, and that was in a gap of several years. So he has the ability to understand the state of psychosis, the state of madness, very subjectively, while at the same time very objectively. And he also talks about what are the medical discourses on madness, and especially in the state of psychosis. Now, he says that in a medical discourse, the madness is viewed in a different way than the madness is viewed by a madman while he is in a state of madness. And there is a great range of ontological shift. There is a shift in the essence of being, while the madness is viewed objectively by the medical discourses and while one is within the state of madness. And there is also a paradigm shift in the ways of seeing. For example, a person who is quote unquote normal and not in a state of psychosis, or not a madman, a normal being, sees something. We have a way of our seeing, while a mad person can be called as delusional and they have hallucinations. Now, according to Custers, hallucination is a way of seeing as well. It says that you cannot say that the way we see is a normal state of seeing and the seeing through hallucination is something abnormal. It has a meaning as well. Now, there is an interesting analogy that Custers has drawn in this book, and it can be realized that the way Custers has talked about madness has a very uncanny similarity between how Heidegger has talked about being. Now that is another analogy that we will talk about in another video if you are interested. But for now, let's stick to Madness as written by Custers. Okay, so now there are four main philosophers that Custers has referred to in this seminal work, and they are Aristotle, Plotinus, Rousseau, and Deleuze. This is perhaps another reason why I have chosen to associate this book with this. Now, Walter Custers is also a very interesting person to follow because he says really interesting things like if you tend to philosophize a lot of madness, you are bound to be mad at some point of time. You are bound to enter into a state of a subtle psychosis perhaps. And also he talks about a lot of paradoxes and circular motions, because according to him, psychosis is a kind of state from where you don't generally get to escape. It's a trap, it's a loop. You are stuck in between. And according to him, which is also an interesting part of this book, which we will get into later, is that time and space and architecture and the length and breadth of the room you are in all has a different dimension, a different definition, a different way of approach to it. Now, the problem that Custers has with psychoanalysts and psychologists is that they tend to develop a medical framework to explain the madness of a mad person. According to Custers, madness is something that can be approached from the perspective of madness and not from the strict and very rigid frameworks that has been developed by medical discourses. Yes, obviously it is needed for determining or diagnosing your sickness, but the illness that one feels while they are in a state of madness or psychosis has a different framework which cannot be measured in the given strict structured medical discourses. Now, as per my understanding, this book is an attempt for translation. It translates the deviation that causes the disorder, because according to medical sciences, it is said that as a madman deviates from the normal way of thinking or the normal sense and meaning of languages, that makes them a madman. And that is actually Custers' opinion, that and his approach, that he needs to find a meaning and he needs to let the world know that there is a meaning in madness as well. So the first line of the preface reads as, "Everything is lost in translation, but it is also duplicated and improved in translation." So that was about the book and Custers, and now let's get into the context of the book. Now, A Philosophy of Madness is a pretty huge book, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is that I'm not going to explain all of the things that are present in the book, but I have sorted out and I've curated some interesting topics and points that I would like to talk about, that would be a very interesting point to discuss, and also talk about the meaning of madness that I was talking about. So the first thing that I would like to mention is the concept of circular time. Now, in this book, Custers himself writes about circular time, and I'm going to read a quote, and it says, "If wasps fly according to God's will, if people on the street move as was decided in the plan, and if the rain comes down at exactly the right moment, then everything is already determined. In the mad world, there is only the eternal repetition of the same pattern." Now he says that how do we measure time inside the domain of madness? It says that, Custers says that madness is the state of madness is the replica of reality itself, but except that there is no sequence in the mad time, and the patterns of time tends to repeat, because the things tends to repeat while they are in madness. Now this reminds me of the series. It is in Netflix, and it is a German series. It is called Dark, which also reminds me a quote from T.S. Eliot, and it reads, "Time present and time past are both perhaps in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is eternally undeemable." So this relates to a lot of factors in time, and it says that there is actually no straight line sequence in time, in measuring time, and that is how we have to understand madness in terms of time. The next factor that Custers delves into about madness is the language. Now, if you remember, and if you have watched my first part, Deleuze and Guattari in their book Anti-Oedipus also talks about how the schizophrenics scramble the code, and there is a distortion in the meaning of the language when a schizophrenic is dealing with the same language as a non-schizophrenic person. Now, Custers writes about language, and he has termed this chapter as delangualization, and the first part of the chapter is mute language. Now, he writes that you also become separated from the linguistic habits and codes of normal communication, and you can even estranged from the accepted definitions and sentence structure. The language of daily intercourse falls mute. So the codes that we normally talk about, normally make meanings from, tends to fall mute in the state of psychosis. While a person is in a state of psychosis, the normal codes that you and me communicate with tends to fall mute, and there is a different strata of codes that is generated within the state of man. The next factor that Custers talks about is architecture, but from the perspective of someone who is facing or who is within a psychosis. He talks about mad architecture. Now, there's a difference between a place and a space. A place is the geographical location where you are located, or suppose a structure, this building is the place. And space is the imagined reality, or the ontological development of the reality that you have created. So Custers talks about this space, and there are very interesting explanations in this book that describes the architecture. For example, the rooms of the house that refers to psychosis has a different length and breadth. The space is different, the dimensions are different, and time in this building or this structure of psychosis is measured through units of rhythm. Thinking from the mad perspective. Now, Custers refers to this as de-thinking, and the chapter that I will be reading my next quote from is referred as Beyond Thought. Now, the quote that I have picked up it reads as, "The last step on the way to insight is that of de-thinking. The thinking that is beginning de-thought on the mystical path is discursive, logical, or conceptual thinking. That is to say, it is thinking in which a distinction is made between the thinker, the thought, and the things being thought about. In mystical madness, these three are a single unity, a non-thinking, a beholding, a being present." Now, Custers refers to thinking with several forms of thought. One is referred to as de-thought, that leads to de-thinking, and also non-thought, that refers to non-thinking. Now, there are certain things that Custers has interestingly pointed out, is that thinking from the perspective of a mad person, or a madman, or a person who is who is witnessing the psychosis, is that it feels like that there is a kind of influence of heavy drugs such as LSD. In fact, he also mentions that thinking or non-thinking under the influence of LSD. Now, there is another quote that I would like to read, and it reads as, "It is difficult to describe this non-thinking in any greater detail without ascribing a positive, thoughtful content to it. Non-thinking is sometimes regarded as another form of thinking, rethinking after de-thinking." So, the general things that or the general approach to thinking perhaps have changed, but there is an individual pattern that the person witnessing the psychosis or within the psychosis thinks about. And even though the things are different from the normal spectrum of thoughts, but it still tends to find a meaning of its own. That is what Custers has referred to in his beyond thought concept. Now, this idea of thinking, or rather dethinking, digs more deeper when he talks about spaces. And in this chapter, where he talks about ordinary space, it is said that geography is different than history. And by this he means that there is a difference between space and time, or the measurement of space and time from a normal perspective, and the definition or the measurement of space and time from the perspective of a madman experiencing psychosis. And while he is thinking, that, or rather dethinking, in the state of psychosis, he has written an interesting thing, and it says, "What is then a space? As long as no one asks me, I know. As soon as I wish to explain it to him who asks, I know not." So, as thinking does not work in a regular pace for a normal person, as like a normal person for a madman, so the outcome of the thinking is also different. When somebody asks you, or a normal person who is not experiencing the psychosis, what space is to you, they might be able to explain it to them. But when a person who is within the psychosis, even though he is well aware and capable of understanding or making meaning of the time and space he is in, but he won't be able to explain it to the person who has asked it, which is because that there is a vast sense of difference between the time and space for the one who has asked, that is the one who is not experiencing the psychosis, and the person who is supposed to answer, and that is the person who is experiencing the psychosis. Now he gives a very clear example of how time and space, or the surrounding, or the society in general, is supposed to act on both of them, for a person who is not experiencing psychosis and a person who is in psychosis. And he writes that in no other illness is the outer environment the situation of such decisive significance as that of psychotic. And then he continues to write that a person who is not experiencing psychosis, or is not in a state of madness, are more vulnerable or more sensitive to the changes that is around him, while a person who is in the state of psychosis does not seem to be vulnerable to these changes, because without depth, there is no anchoring. Without the difference between foreground and background, there is no foundation. As the dimensions of space and time is changing, so their anchoring and backgrounding or foregrounding, all of these factors has been changing, which makes their sense of space and time different, which is why they are not reacting in a similar way as they should be to all the vulnerabilities, or all the desires, and all the communication that is going on around them. Now, as we come to the end of the book, there is a chapter called "The Mad Plan in Story and System," and this part refers to as the blueprint, and the subsection is named as "The Myth and the Plan." And this part is very interesting. At least I have found it very interesting, because there is a certain democratic approach to madness. And Custers writes that madness is something that is deviated or distorted sense of thinking, language, system, because there are very few people who can sort of witness for it or provide social proofs for it, while the medical discourse, or the quote unquote normal discourse, has a major opinion, or majority of people providing opinion towards it. You, me, or someone like us will be able to state the perspective of normal thinking, normal language, normal communication, while a person or people who are in psychosis would not be able to state their opinion as much as clear, or perhaps they would be stating them clearly, but we won't be able to communicate with them because their code is scrambled, just like we read in Anti-Oedipus. Now he writes that what is the difference between the vision or the hallucinations or the psychotic behavior of a madman and the myths that we have in our culture. Now Custers writes that first, myths are stories that fulfill an important guiding role in culture and are universally recognized and acknowledged. The stories in madness, on the other hand, are those of a single individual. Although they may have general characteristics in their underlying structure, that is why you can say my delusion and not my myth. Now, the whole point lies in the fact that it is my delusion and not my myth, or we say myth in general. This makes the total difference. Last and the most interesting thing that I would like to mention about A Philosophy of Madness is that it also talks about how reality works. Now, reality can be viewed under two lenses. From the perspective of medical discourse, the reality that a psychotic person is a part of is unreal, while at the same time the reality the normal people are a part of is unreal from the perspective of the madman or the psychotic person. So there is absolutely no way to determine what is actually the reality and what is actually the unreality. Both are very real from their own subjective perspectives, while when viewed objectively it seems unreal. Now, Custers has very interestingly provided an equation sort of a statement, and it says that the realness of reality is the unreality, and it works both ways in medical discourses and as well as within the sense of or being of psychosis. Now, Custers also mentions that there are two extremities of reality, and the one is hyper reality and the one is hypo reality. And this also takes me back to Anti-Oedipus, where we talked about how schizophrenia being the limit of capitalism, and here the realities are being limited. Now that's it with A Philosophy of Madness. And so we are ultimately done with both of these books, Anti-Oedipus and A Philosophy of Madness. Now there are several factors that we have established. The first being language, and how the language or the code changes from sanity to insanity. We have talked about the binaries of sanity and insanity, some states of mental illnesses, and society in general, and how there are certain preconceived notions on the distortion of meaning, on the distortion of language, and how they are otherized. That leads to this clear distinction between madness or sanity and insanity rather. So that's it for this video. I hope you liked it, and if you did, please like, share and subscribe. And if you have anything to say about my explanation on these two books, or in this video particularly about this one, please mention them in the comment section below. And also let me know what kind of philosophy videos would you like to see next. That's it for this video. Thank you. See you in the next one.